They say, a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth even puts on its shoes. Mine didn't just travel, it destroyed everything I loved. It took my husband, my home, my reputation, and nearly broke my spirit. But here I am, decades later, sitting in my sunlit kitchen with my granddaughter curled up beside me, asking me to tell her about the hardest time in my life. And I'll tell her, because she needs to know that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the prettiest lies, and sometimes the strongest revenge is simply surviving with your dignity intact. It was 1978, and we lived in a modest but lovely home in the suburbs of Sacramento, California. The neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew everyone, where children played hopscotch on sidewalks lined with jacaranda trees, and where the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the scent of roses from Mrs. Henderson's garden next door. Our house was a pale yellow two-story with white shutters, nothing fancy, but it was ours. Richard and I had bought it 5 years into our marriage, right after our son Tommy was born. I can still remember the day we got the keys. How Richard lifted me over the threshold even though I laughed and told him that was only for newlyweds. He kissed my forehead and said, "Every day with you feels new." Those words would haunt me later, when I learned just how new he wanted things to be. Richard was a good man, or so I thought. Everyone thought so. He worked as a regional manager for an insurance company, the kind of job that required nice suits and confidence and a firm handshake. He had all of those things. Women at church functions would compliment me on what a catch he was. Tall and broad-shouldered, with that easy smile that made people trust him instantly. I'd beam with pride, never noticing the way some of those women's eyes lingered on him a moment too long, or the way he'd lean in just a little closer than necessary when speaking to them. I was a good wife. I say that not out of pride, but simply as fact. I kept our home immaculate, cooked dinner every night, helped Tommy with his homework at the kitchen table while something bubbled on the stove. I worked part-time at the local library, just enough to feel useful and bring in a little extra money, but never so much that it interfered with Richard's needs or Tommy's schedule. I pressed Richard's shirts until they were crisp. I remembered his mother's birthday. I laughed at his jokes even when I'd heard them before. I believed in our marriage the way some people believe in religion. Absolutely, and without question. The cracks started so small I told myself I was imagining them. Richard began working late, sometimes not coming home until 9 or 10 at night. He'd walk through the door exhausted, loosening his tie with one hand while waving off my concern with the other. "Big project at work," he'd say, or "the boss is riding everyone hard right now." I'd reheat his dinner, sit with him while he ate, ask about his day. His answers grew shorter, his eyes more distant, as if he was looking past me to something I couldn't see. Then there were the phone calls. Our phone would ring, and when I'd answer, there'd be silence on the other end before a click. It happened so often, I mentioned it to Richard, worried we had a faulty line. He barely looked up from his newspaper. "Probably just wrong numbers," he muttered. But sometimes, when he answered, he'd take the phone into the hallway, stretching the cord taut, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite make out. When I asked who it was, he'd say it was work, always work. I found the lipstick stain on his collar on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were laundry day, and I'd been sorting his work shirts when I saw it. A smudge of coral pink on the white collar of his best shirt. My heart stuttered in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe someone at work had hugged him in congratulations. Maybe it was from when we'd been at the Johnsons' party last month and everyone had been drinking too much wine and getting friendly. I scrubbed at it with stain remover until my fingers ached, watching the pink fade to nothing, wishing I could remove my doubt as easily. I never said a word about it. That's something I'd regret later. That silence. That willingness to swallow my suspicions rather than confront what I already knew deep down. But we'd been taught, women of my generation, to keep the peace, to trust our husbands, to never be the nagging wife who drove her man away with accusations and tears. So I smiled, and I cooked, and I pretended that everything was fine, even as the foundation of my marriage crumbled beneath my feet. The letter came on a Wednesday morning in April. Tommy had just left for school, his backpack bouncing against his small shoulders as he ran to meet the neighbor kids at the corner. I was still in my bathrobe, my hair in curlers, planning my day around grocery shopping and returning books to the library. The mail hadn't come yet. The postman didn't usually arrive until noon, but there it was, a plain white envelope on our doormat, my name typed across the front, no address, no stamp, no return address. Just my name. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message typed in those old-fashioned typewriter letters that looked somehow both official and sinister. Your husband should know what kind of woman he married. Ask her about the neighbor. Ask her about Tuesday afternoons when he's at work. That was all. No signature, no details, nothing else. Just those 2 sentences that made my blood run cold. I read it 3 times, 4 times, trying to make sense of it. What neighbor? What Tuesday afternoons? I was at the library on Tuesday afternoons, or running errands, or at home cleaning. There was no affair, no secret meetings, no betrayal on my part. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, maybe something meant for someone else that had been left at our door by accident. I should have thrown it away. God, how I wish I'd thrown it away. But instead, I left it on the kitchen counter, visible, because I had nothing to hide. When Richard came home that evening, he'd see it. We'd laugh about it together, maybe even call the police about harassment. I went about my day in a daze, the words echoing in my head, trying to figure out who would do such a thing, and why. Richard came home early that day. I heard his car in the driveway at 3 in the afternoon, and my first thought was that something was wrong, that he was sick or there'd been a problem at work. I was folding laundry in the living room when he walked in, and the look on his face stopped me cold. He wasn't sick. He was furious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and hard in a way I'd never heard before. He held up the letter, my letter, the one I'd left on the counter. "Want to explain this?" I stared at him, confused, my arms still full of Tommy's small t-shirts. "I don't understand. I found that this morning. Someone left it on our doorstep." "It's not true, Richard. I don't know what it's talking about." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You don't know. You don't know about sneaking around with David next door, about the afternoons you spend at his place while his wife's at work and I'm busting my back to provide for this family. David, our neighbor David, the accountant with the quiet wife and the twins. I'd spoken to him maybe a dozen times in the 5 years we'd lived here. Mostly about trimming the hedge that grew between our properties or accepting packages when his wife wasn't home. He was pleasant enough, balding and soft-spoken, the kind of man who wore cardigans and talked about tax codes. The idea of having an affair with him would have been laughable if Richard's face hadn't been so deadly serious. "That's insane," I said, my voice rising. "Richard, I would never." "Who told you this? Who's saying these things? Does it matter?" He threw the letter on the coffee table. "I've seen the evidence." "What evidence?" "Richard, please, there's no evidence because nothing happened." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, his movements sharp and angry. Inside were photographs, 3 of them, grainy, and taken from a distance. In one, I appeared to be standing close to a man on a porch. In another, there was someone who looked like me getting into a car with someone who might have been David. In the third, 2 figures stood in a doorway, too blurry to make out clearly, but the woman wore a dress similar to one I owned. I grabbed the photos, holding them close to my face, trying to see what he was seeing. The woman in the pictures had my general build, my hair color, but the images were so unclear, taken from so far away. "This isn't me," I said, my voice shaking. "Richard, I swear to you, this isn't me." "When were these supposedly taken? Where?" "Last Tuesday, and the Tuesday before that. My secretary brought them to me today. Said she hated to be the one to tell me, but she thought I deserved to know." Julia. Of course, it was Julia, his secretary, who'd been working for him for the past 8 months. Young, maybe 25, with perfectly styled blonde hair and skirts that seemed to get shorter every time I saw her. She'd been to our house twice for work dinners, and both times I'd caught her watching Richard with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I'd mentioned it to Richard once, gently, and he'd laughed it off. "She's just enthusiastic about her job," he'd said. "Julia brought you these. Richard, think about this. Why would your secretary have photos of your wife? How would she even get them? This is a setup. Someone's trying to break us up." But he was already shaking his head, his jaw set in that stubborn way that meant his mind was made up. "She hired a private investigator because she was concerned. She's been watching you act strange, making excuses to leave the office early, taking long lunch breaks." She put it together. "That's ridiculous. I don't even know Julia that well. Why would she care about my schedule? Because she's a good person who cares about me. Unlike some people." The words hit me like a slap. I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Richard, I love you. I have never cheated on you. I don't know what's happening here, but someone is lying to you. Please, please believe me." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe doubt. Maybe the remnants of the love we'd shared, but then it was gone, replaced by cold certainty. "My mother was right about you," he said quietly. "She said you seemed too good to be true. Said women like you always have something to hide." His mother, of course she'd be involved too. Eleanor had never approved of me. Thought Richard should have married someone from a better family, someone with more education, more money, more pedigree. She'd spent the past 12 years making subtle digs about my cooking, my housekeeping, the way I raised Tommy. She'd love this, I realized, with dawning horror. She'd finally have the ammunition she needed to push me out of Richard's life. "I want you out," Richard said. "Pack your things. I'll give you until the end of the week." "What about Tommy?" "Richard, he's our son. He'll stay with me. I'm not having my boy raised by a woman who can't keep her wedding vows." I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think I begged. I know I cried. I remember calling David's house and getting his wife on the phone, asking her if she'd noticed anything strange, if anyone had been taking pictures around our houses. She got defensive, asked me what I was implying about her husband, and hung up on me. I tried to show Richard that the photos couldn't be accurate, pointing out inconsistencies in the dates and times, but he wouldn't listen. He'd made up his mind, or someone had made it up for him. His parents arrived the next day. Eleanor swept into our home like an avenging angel, her face pinched with righteous fury. Richard's father, usually quiet and mild-mannered, stood behind her with his arms crossed, looking at me like I was something distasteful he'd stepped in. They'd clearly already been told everything, their version of everything, where I was the villain and their son was the victim. "Disgraceful," Eleanor hissed at me as I stood in my own kitchen, still wearing my bathrobe because I hadn't been able to bring myself to get dressed. "We raised Richard to be a good Christian man, and this is how you repay his devotion. Running around with the neighbor like some kind of common trollop." "Mrs. Hayes, I didn't do anything. Someone is lying." "Oh, save it. We've seen the photos. Julia showed us everything. That poor girl, having to be the one to expose you, it must have broken her heart." "I bet it did," I thought bitterly. "I bet it broke her heart right into Richard's arms." They gave me 3 days. 3 days to pack up 12 years of marriage, to sort through the life I'd built into boxes and suitcases, to figure out where I was going to go and how I was going to survive. Richard stayed at his parents' house during those days, wouldn't answer my calls, wouldn't look at me when he came by to get clothes. Tommy cried and asked why Mommy was leaving, why Daddy was so angry, and I didn't know what to tell him. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes people believe lies over truth? That sometimes the person you love most in the world can turn on you based on photographs and gossip? I packed in a fog. My wedding dress went into a box, along with photo albums and the good china we'd received as gifts, my clothes, my books, the small things that made up my identity. But I couldn't take much. I had nowhere to go. No money of my own beyond the small savings account I'd been putting library wages into. Richard controlled our finances, paid all the bills, held all the cards. I was about to learn just how vulnerable that made me. The divorce papers came fast, filed by a lawyer Eleanor had hired. Adultery, they claimed. Abandonment of marriage. I was painted as the guilty party, and in California, in 1978, that meant everything. Richard wanted full custody, wanted the house, wanted me to leave with almost nothing. I hired a lawyer with money I didn't have, borrowed from my sister who lived 3 states away and who I hadn't spoken to in years. But my lawyer told me the truth, without proof of my innocence, without evidence to counter the photos and the testimony Julia was prepared to give. I was going to lose everything. I moved into a tiny apartment in a rough part of town, the only place I could afford with my limited funds. It was a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like cigarette smoke and fried food, with thin walls and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. My furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, a card table, and 2 folding chairs. I'd left almost everything behind because Richard said it belonged to the house, to Tommy, to the life I no longer had any right to. The first night in that apartment, I sat on the floor and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that shook my whole body, that made me fold in on myself like I was trying to physically hold myself together. Everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, everyone I'd loved, gone. Destroyed by lies I couldn't prove false, by photos that might show anyone, by the word of a woman I barely knew against the word of a wife of 12 years. But I couldn't afford to break down. Tommy needed me. even if I could only see him every other weekend. Supervised visits because Richard's lawyer had convinced the judge I was an unfit mother. I needed a job, a real job, something that paid more than the library had. I needed to survive this, even if I didn't know how yet. The whispers started almost immediately. Sacramento wasn't that big a town, and Richard knew people. His company had clients throughout the area. His parents were involved in their church. His mother had friends in every social circle that mattered. Within a week, everyone seemed to know about the scandal. The librarian at my old job called to say they'd decided to go in a different direction, that they didn't need part-time help anymore. I saw women I'd known from Tommy's school cross the street rather than walk past me. The grocery store checkout girl smirked when she saw my name on my check, like she knew something, like I was exactly what everyone was saying I was. I found work cleaning houses. It was the only job I could get, places where no one asked questions or checked references, where they just needed someone to scrub toilets and mop floors. I cleaned homes that were twice the size of the one I'd lost, picked up after families who had what I used to have, put away toys that reminded me of Tommy's. I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, my hands raw from chemicals, my back aching from bending and reaching and carrying. The money was barely enough for rent and food. Nothing left over, nothing to save. Tommy visited on court-ordered weekends. Richard would drop him off at the curb, wouldn't even look at me, would just wait until Tommy was at my door before driving away. My son would climb those 3 flights of stairs to my tiny apartment, and I'd watch his face try to hide his reaction to how far we'd fallen. He never complained, not once. He'd help me cook dinner on the hot plate. We'd play cards at the card table. We'd make a fort out of blankets and my mattress and pretend we were camping. But I could see the questions in his eyes, the confusion, the pain of being caught between 2 parents who'd once loved each other and now couldn't be in the same room. "Mom," he asked me one night, about 3 months after I'd left, "did you really do what Dad says you did?" We were lying on my mattress, looking up at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the couple next door argue through the thin walls. I wanted to lie to him, to tell him that yes, I'd made a mistake, I'd done something wrong, because at least then his world would make sense, but I couldn't do it. "No, baby," I said, pulling him close. "I didn't. I promise you, I didn't." "Then why did you have to leave?" "Because sometimes people believe lies more than they believe the truth, and sometimes there's nothing you can do to change their minds. You just have to live your life and hope that eventually the truth comes out." He was quiet for a long time, his small body warm against mine. Then he said, "It's okay, Mom, we still have us." I cried after he fell asleep that night, silently, my face pressed into my pillow so I wouldn't wake him. He was 7 years old and having to be the strong one, having to comfort his mother, having to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. I vowed then that I would survive this, not for me, but for him. I would build a life, even from nothing, even from lies and ashdot. The divorce was finalized 6 months after Richard had thrown me out. I got nothing, no alimony because I was the guilty party. Limited visitation because I was considered a bad influence. I had to pay my own legal fees, which meant debt that would take me years to climb out of. Richard got the house, the car, the savings, and primary custody of our son. Julia, I heard through the grapevine, had been promoted to office manager. She and Richard were seen together around town, at restaurants and movie theaters, not even trying to hide it anymore. I wanted to hate him. God, I wanted to hate him so much, but mostly I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me walking around as an empty shell. I'd lost the ability to trust, to hope, to believe that good things could happen to good people. I moved through my days mechanically, work, eat, sleep, repeat. On the weekends Tommy visited, I came alive again. But the moment Richard's car pulled away with my son in the back seat, I felt myself shutting down again. The other cleaning ladies I worked with were kind to me, in their way. They didn't ask questions about my past, didn't judge the fact that I lived in a studio apartment and wore thrift store clothes. We shared cigarettes on breaks, and complained about difficult clients. And slowly, very slowly, I began to remember how to talk to people without shame choking my words. One of them, Maria, told me her cousin was looking for a bookkeeper for his auto repair shop. Someone who could manage invoices and payroll. I'd never done bookkeeping before, but I'd always been good with numbers, and I was desperate to get out of cleaning houses. I took night classes at the community college, learning accounting and office skills, studying at my card table until late into the night, my textbooks lit by the single lamp I owned. It took me a year, but I got a certificate, and then I got the job at the auto shop. It paid better than cleaning, enough that I could move to a slightly less depressing apartment, one with a bedroom and a kitchen that wasn't just a hot plate. I bought a used couch from a yard sale, a TV that only got 3 channels, plates that didn't match but were mine. I was building something, slowly, brick by brick. Years passed. Tommy grew older, went to middle school, then high school. The court eventually loosened the custody arrangement, and by the time he was 12, he could choose when he wanted to visit me. He chose me more and more often, spending long weekends and summer weeks in my small apartment, helping me cook dinner and telling me about school and his friends. He never talked much about life at his father's house, but I could read between the lines. Richard had married Julia, and the marriage was not what either of them had expected. I heard things, of course. Sacramento was small enough that gossip traveled, and I'd built a life for myself by then, had friends and co-workers who kept me informed. Richard's business had taken a hit during the recession. Julia had expensive tastes, liked designer clothes and luxury vacations that they couldn't really afford. They fought constantly, according to people who'd seen them at restaurants or heard them at parties. Julia was jealous, they said, always accusing Richard of looking at other women, of being too friendly with female clients. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't gloat. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I just felt tired and a little sad for everyone involved. I'd built a good life for myself by then, out of necessity and sheer stubbornness. I'd gotten a better job at an accounting firm, doing bookkeeping for small businesses. I'd made friends, real friends, who knew my story and believed me. I'd learned to be alone without being lonely, to find joy in small things like Sunday morning coffee and books from the library, and phone calls with Tommy. I never remarried. People suggested it sometimes, co-workers who wanted to set me up with their brothers or cousins, friends who thought I needed a man to be complete, but I didn't want another husband. I'd learned to trust myself, to rely on myself, to build a life that was mine and couldn't be taken away by someone else's lies. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, men who were pleasant company for dinner or a movie, but who I never let too close. I was content, or as content as someone who'd lost everything could be. Tommy graduated high school in 1989, 11 years after my world had fallen apart. He'd grown into a fine young man, tall like his father but with my eyes and my sense of humor. He'd been accepted to UC Berkeley, a full scholarship, and I was so proud of him I thought my heart might burst. Richard was at the graduation, of course, sitting with Julia several rows away from me. I didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge them, just kept my eyes on my son as he walked across that stage and accepted his diploma. After the ceremony, Tommy came to me first. He hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for everything." I knew what he meant. For surviving, for building a life, for never giving up, for showing him that you could be knocked down and still get back up. Richard approached us as we were leaving, Julia trailing behind him. He looked older than he should have, his hair graying, his face lined with stress. Julia looked brittle, her smile forced, her hand tight on Richard's arm like she was afraid he might drift away. "Congratulations, Tommy," Richard said, his voice gruff. "Your mother and I are very proud." Your mother and I, as if we were a unit, as if we'd parented together all these years. I felt Tommy tense beside me, but I squeezed his hand. This wasn't the time or place. "Thank you, Dad," Tommy said politely. Then, he turned to me. "Ready to go, Mom? Everyone's meeting at the restaurant." I nodded, and we walked away, leaving Richard and Julia standing in the parking lot. I could feel Richard's eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. I'd spent 11 years learning not to look back. Tommy went off to college, and my apartment felt emptier than it ever had. But I kept busy. I'd been promoted to senior bookkeeper at my firm, was managing accounts for some of the larger clients. I'd moved to a nicer apartment, one in a good neighborhood with hardwood floors and a balcony where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. I'd furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing pieces that I loved, rather than settling for what I could afford. I took up watercolor painting, joined a book club, volunteered at the women's shelter on weekends. I had a life, a good life, one I'd built from nothing. The years rolled on. Tommy graduated from Berkeley, got a job at a tech company in Silicon Valley, started dating a sweet girl named Rebecca who worked in marketing. I saw them for holidays and the occasional weekend, and watching my son happy and successful made every hard year worth it. He'd turned out well despite everything. Maybe because of everything, it was the winter of 2001 when I got the call. Tommy's voice was strange on the phone. tight and strained in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child, watching his parents' marriage fall apart. Mom, can you come to my place this weekend? I need to talk to you about something. In person. My heart sank. Was he sick? Was Rebecca pregnant? Had he lost his job? I drove to San Jose that Saturday morning, my mind running through every possibility, my hands tight on the steering wheel. Tommy opened the door before I could knock, and I knew immediately that something was very wrong. His face was pale, his eyes red like he'd been crying or hadn't slept. He pulled me into a hug that lasted too long, and when he let go, he couldn't quite meet my eyes. What is it? I asked, following him into his apartment. Tommy, you're scaring me. He sat down heavily on his couch, and I sat beside him, taking his hand. He held a letter in his other hand, the paper trembling slightly. I got this yesterday, he said quietly. It's from Julia. Dad's Julia. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't heard that name in years, had done my best to forget she existed. What does she want? She's dying. Mom, pancreatic cancer. She's in hospice. He paused, swallowed hard. She wanted to confess. She wanted someone to know the truth before she died. The world seemed to tilt sideways. What truth? Tommy handed me the letter, and I read it with shaking hands. It was typed, probably because Julia was too weak to write by hand, but it was signed in a spidery scrawl at the bottom. Dear Tommy, it began, I'm writing this because I won't be alive much longer, and I can't die with this on my conscience. What I did to your mother was unforgivable, and I need someone to know the truth, even if it's too late to make things right. The letter went on to explain everything, how Julia had been obsessed with Richard from the moment she started working for him, how she'd tried to seduce him but he'd turned her down, had been faithful to his wife, how her obsession had turned to hatred of me, the woman who had what she wanted, how she'd hired someone to follow me, to take photos of any woman who looked vaguely like me, to doctor them to look compromising, how she'd typed that first anonymous letter herself, how she'd shown Richard the evidence and played on his insecurities, his ego, his mother's existing dislike of me, how she'd testified in the divorce proceedings, had lied under oath about seeing me with other men, about overhearing phone calls, about proof that never existed. I destroyed a good woman's life because I wanted her husband, the letter read. And the worst part is, I got what I wanted, and it was nothing like I'd imagined. Richard never loved me the way he loved her. He knew it, I knew it. Our marriage was a punishment for both of us. He was angry all the time, bitter, filled with regret, and I was jealous and paranoid, always worried he'd realize what he'd lost and leave me. We made each other miserable for over 20 years. The letter ended with an apology. Tell your mother I'm sorry. Tell her she was innocent, that she did nothing wrong, that the life she lost was stolen from her by a selfish, cruel woman. Tell her that Richard knows the truth now too. I confessed to him last week, and he's been sitting by my bedside every day since, crying for what he threw away. Tell her that we both got exactly what we deserved. Tell her I hope she found happiness, because God knows she earned it. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. 23 years. 23 years of carrying the weight of that accusation, of wondering if I'd somehow brought it on myself, of living with the label of adulteress and homer. 23 years, and it had all been a lie, just like I'd said from the beginning. Mom, Tommy said, his voice breaking, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I ever doubted you. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I'm so sorry. Stop, I said gently, pulling him close. You were a child. You didn't doubt me, not really, and I survived it. Tommy, I survived, and I built a good life. I have you, and that's more than enough. We sat together on that couch for a long time, holding each other, crying for the years that had been stolen, for the lies that had destroyed so much. Eventually, Tommy told me that Richard wanted to see me, that he'd been calling every day, begging for a chance to apologize in person. I told Tommy I'd think about it, but I already knew what my answer would be. A week later, I drove to Sacramento for the first time in years. The city had changed, grown larger and more modern. But the old neighborhood where Richard and I had lived looked almost the same. The jacaranda trees were bigger now, and the yellow house with white shutters had been repainted gray, but it was still recognizable. I didn't stop there. Instead, I drove to the address Tommy had given me, a small house on the other side of town. Richard answered the door himself. He looked old, much older than 55 should look. His hair was completely gray, his face deeply lined, his shoulders stooped like he was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice rough. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, I admitted, but I thought we both deserved closure. He invited me in, and I followed him into a living room that was neat but impersonal, like a hotel room or a place where no one really lived. He offered me coffee and I accepted, needing something to do with my hands. We sat across from each other in matching armchairs, the coffee cooling between us, neither of us quite knowing where to start. I'm sorry, he finally said. I know those words aren't enough, can never be enough, but I need to say them anyway. I'm sorry, I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I threw you out. I'm sorry I took Tommy from you. I'm sorry I let my pride and my ego and my mother destroy the best thing that ever happened to me. I listened, watching him, this man I'd once loved more than life itself. He was a stranger now, someone I'd known in another lifetime. The anger I'd carried for so long had faded to something softer, something like pity. Julia confessed everything, he continued, his voice breaking. Every lie, every manipulation. She showed me the real photos, the ones before she had them doctored. The woman in those pictures wasn't you. It was her friend, someone she hired to pose as you. The anonymous letters, the rumors she spread, the testimony she gave in court, all lies. And I believed her. I believed her over you, over 12 years of marriage, over everything we'd built together. Why? I asked quietly. That's what I've never understood. Why was it so easy for you to believe I'd betrayed you? He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like the answer might be there. My father cheated on my mother, he finally said. I was 10 when I found out. It destroyed our family, destroyed my mother. She never recovered from it, never trusted anyone again. I swore I'd never be like him, never put a woman through that. But I was so paranoid about being cheated on that when Julia showed me those photos, it confirmed everything I'd been afraid of. It wasn't about evidence or logic. It was about fear. So you destroyed our marriage because you were afraid of becoming your father. Do you see how twisted that is? I do now. I've had 23 years to see it, to regret it, to hate myself for it. I made us both miserable, you and me and Julia and Tommy. Everyone lost because of my cowardice. He reached toward me, then seemed to think better of it, pulling his hand back. I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance, any possibility that we could know? I said firmly, cutting him off. Whatever we had is gone, Richard. It died the day you chose to believe a stranger over your wife. It died when you threw me out of our home. It died when you kept my son from me. You can't resurrect something that's been dead for over 2 decades. His face crumpled, and he began to cry. Deep sobs that shook his whole body. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know that you were always the good one. You were always faithful, always loving, always true, and I threw it all away. I watched him cry, this broken man who'd once been my whole world, and I felt nothing but a distant sadness, not for him, but for who we'd both been, for the life we could have had, for the years we'd wasted on lies and pride and fear. I forgave you a long time ago, I said quietly, and his head jerked up, hope flickering in his red-rimmed eyes. I held up a hand before he could speak. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I want you back in my life. It just means I stopped carrying the weight of what you did to me. I forgave you so I could move on, not so you could feel better about yourself. I understand, he whispered, though the hope died in his eyes. I stood up, setting my untouched coffee on the table between us. I have a good life now, Richard. I have friends and work I enjoy and a son who loves me. I have peace. And I'm not going to give that up. Not for you, not for anyone. What you and Julia did to me was cruel and unforgivable, but it also taught me that I'm stronger than I ever knew. I survived the worst thing I could imagine, and I came out the other side better for it. He stood too, his movements slow and painful. Can I at least stay in touch with Tommy? Be part of his life? That's between you and him. He's a grown man now. He can make his own decisions about who he wants in his life. I paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. I hope you find some peace, Richard. I really do. But you're not going to find it with me. I walked out of that house and climbed into my car, and as I drove away, I felt lighter than I had in years. I'd spent so long imagining this moment, what I'd say to him, if I ever got the chance. How I'd make him understand what he'd done to me. But in the end, the revenge I'd dreamed of seemed hollow and pointless. He was already punished, had been punishing himself for years. Adding to his misery wouldn't heal mine. The truth had finally come out, just like I'd told Tommy it would all those years ago, when we'd lain on my mattress in that tiny apartment and he'd asked if I'd really done what his father said. The truth had waited, patient and quiet, and it had spoken in its own time, not when I'd needed it to, not when it could have saved my marriage or my reputation or those lost years, but when it was ready, and somehow that was enough. I drove home to my apartment in the city, the one with the hardwood floors and the balcony where I could watch the sunset. I made myself dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat outside as the sky turned orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in Sacramento, Richard was probably still crying, drowning in regrets he could never undo. Somewhere in a hospice, Julia was dying with a confession on her lips. And somewhere in San Jose, my son was probably calling Rebecca to tell her about his mother's quiet victory. But I wasn't thinking about any of them. I was thinking about the life I'd built, the person I'd become. I'd lost everything once, had been branded and humiliated and cast out. But I'd survived. I'd worked and struggled and clawed my way back to dignity. I'd raised a good son despite everything stacked against me. I'd learned to stand on my own 2 feet, to trust myself, to find joy in small things and peace in solitude. The lie had traveled fast, had destroyed my life in a matter of weeks, but the truth, slow as it was, had arrived eventually, and I was still standing. Years passed, as they do. Tommy married Rebecca in a beautiful ceremony overlooking the bay, and I sat in the front row watching my son promise to love and honor and cherish his bride, and I cried happy tears. Richard was there too, sitting in the back, alone. Julia had died 6 months after her confession, and he hadn't remarried. Tommy had decided to maintain a relationship with his father, cautious and distant but present, because he said everyone deserved a second chance at redemption. I didn't argue with him. It wasn't my place to decide who Tommy forgave or how he moved forward. He was my son, but he was also his own person. Rebecca gave birth to my first grandchild in 2004, a little girl they named Sarah after my mother. I held her in the hospital, this tiny perfect thing with her father's eyes and her mother's nose, and I felt my heart crack open in a way I'd forgotten was possible. She was hope and possibility and second chances all wrapped in a pink blanket. Tommy asked me to move closer to them, said they needed me, wanted me to be part of Sarah's life in a way Richard's mother had never been part of his, so I did. I left Sacramento behind for good, moved to a small house in San Jose with a garden where I could grow tomatoes and roses. I retired from bookkeeping and took up babysitting my granddaughter instead, the best job I'd ever had. Sarah and I would spend hours in that garden, her tiny hands helping me pull weeds, her laughter filling up all the empty spaces I'd carried for so long. More grandchildren came, a boy, Michael, 2 years after Sarah, then twins, Emma and Lily. A few years after that, my small house became the center of Tommy's family, the place they came for Sunday dinners and birthday parties and holidays. I taught my grandchildren to bake cookies and paint pictures and plant seeds. I told them stories about perseverance and truth and standing up for yourself. I never told them about the lies that had destroyed my first life, about their grandfather's betrayal, about the years I'd spent cleaning houses and crying into my pillow. That wasn't their burden to carry. Richard tried to be part of their lives too, showing up for birthdays and Christmas with expensive gifts and a hopeful smile. The children were polite to him, but they didn't run to him the way they ran to me. They didn't curl up in his lap or ask him to read stories or beg him to play one more game. He was a stranger to them, someone their father was kind to but didn't quite trust. I felt sorry for him sometimes, watching him sit on the edges of family gatherings, always on the outside looking in, but I never intervened. These were the consequences of his choices, and he had to live with them. It was 2015 when Tommy sat me down and asked me to tell him everything. The whole story from beginning to end. Sarah was 11 by then, old enough to start asking questions about why Grandma and Grandpa weren't together, why Grandpa seemed sad all the time, why there was this strange tension at family events. Tommy said he wanted to know the truth so he could explain it to his children when they were ready to hear it, so I told him all of it. The letter on the doorstep, the false accusations, the photos that weren't of me, Richard's refusal to believe me, his mother's cruelty, the divorce that left me with nothing, the years of poverty and shame, the struggle to survive and rebuild. I told him about Julia's deathbed confession, about Richard's apologies that came too late, about the choice I'd made to forgive but not forget, to move on but not go back. Tommy cried as I spoke. This grown man with 4 children and a successful career, crying for what his mother had endured while he was too young to understand. When I finished, he held me tight and said, "I'm so proud of you, Mom. I'm so proud of how you survived this, how you never gave up, how you built such a beautiful life despite everything they did to you." "I didn't have a choice," I said simply. "When you hit rock bottom, you either stay there or you start climbing. I had you to think about, so I climbed." It was Sarah, my sweet Sarah, who asked me a few years later why I'd never sought revenge on Grandpa Richard or Julia. She was 14, studying literature in school, reading stories of vengeance and justice and settling scores. We were in the garden together, picking tomatoes for dinner, when she brought it up. "Grandma," she said, her hands full of red fruit, "when I heard what they did to you, I was so angry. I wanted you to make them pay, to hurt them the way they hurt you. But you didn't. Why not?" I considered my answer carefully, wanting to give her something true and meaningful. "Because revenge would have required me to keep carrying them with me, to keep thinking about them, to let them continue to have power over my life. I wanted to be free, Sarah. Really, truly free. And the only way to do that was to let them go, to build a life so full of love and joy and peace that their betrayal became just one chapter in my story, not the whole book." "But didn't you want them to suffer?" she pressed. "Sometimes," I admitted. "There were nights when I was working 3 jobs and could barely afford food, when I wanted them to feel what I was feeling. But here's what I learned. The best revenge is living well. Richard destroyed our marriage, but he also destroyed himself. He spent 23 years in a miserable marriage with a woman who manipulated him. And now he spends his days alone, eaten up by regret. That's punishment enough. I didn't need to add to it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking this over. Then she said, "So you're saying that by being happy, by having us and this house and your garden, you already got your revenge." "I'm saying that revenge isn't about making other people suffer. It's about refusing to let them define you. Julia and your grandfather tried to destroy me, but I wouldn't let them. I built a life they couldn't touch, filled with people who love me and believe in me. That's more powerful than any revenge I could have planned." She smiled at that, my wise young granddaughter, and we carried our tomatoes inside to make sauce for dinner. This simple domestic ritual that was worth more than any vindication or apology or public revelation of the truth. Richard died in 2018, at the age of 72. Heart attack, sudden and massive, in his small house where he'd lived alone for the better part of 2 decades. Tommy called to tell me, his voice heavy with complicated grief, and I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't quite name. Sadness for the man he could have been, for the life we could have had. Relief that this chapter was finally, truly closed. And a strange kind of peace, knowing that he'd gone to his grave carrying the weight of what he'd done. The funeral was small. Tommy and Rebecca were there, of course, and the grandchildren who were old enough to attend. A few old colleagues from Richard's insurance days, some distant relatives. I stood in the back, watching as they lowered him into the ground, and I thought about the young man who'd lifted me over the threshold of our yellow house with white shutters, who'd kissed my forehead and said every day with me felt new. That man had died long before Richard Hayes had drawn his last breath, killed by fear and pride and lies. After the service, Tommy asked if I was okay. I nodded, squeezing his hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I made my peace with your father a long time ago. This is just the final punctuation mark." We drove back to my house together, the whole family, and I made dinner while the children played in the garden, and Tommy and Rebecca sat at my kitchen table, telling stories about Richard's better moments, the times he'd been a decent father and grandfather, the glimmers of the man he might have been if he'd made different choices. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and thought about the past 40 years of my life, the betrayal and the aftermath, the struggle and the survival, the slow building of something new and good and mine. I'd started with nothing, less than nothing really, with a destroyed reputation and a broken heart and no money and no prospects. And I'd built this, a home, a family, a life full of love and meaning and peace. The lie had destroyed me once, but it had also shown me what I was made of, had forced me to discover a strength I never knew I had. In some strange way, Julia and Richard had given me a gift, even as they'd taken everything away. They'd given me the chance to prove to myself that I could survive anything, that I could rise from the ashes, that I could be happy and whole without needing their validation or apology or acknowledgement of the truth. Now, at 78 years old, I sit in my sunny kitchen with my granddaughter, curled up beside me, asking me to tell her about the hardest time in my life. Sarah is 20 now, studying psychology at Stanford, writing a paper about resilience and trauma and survival. She wants to interview me, to understand how I managed to rebuild after such complete devastation. Grandma, she says, her notebook open on her lap, what would you say to someone going through what you went through? Someone who's been falsely accused, who's lost everything, who doesn't know how to keep going. I think about this for a long moment, about all the things I've learned, all the wisdom earned through years of pain and perseverance. I'd tell them that the truth doesn't need you to defend it. It exists whether anyone believes it or not. Your job isn't to convince people of your innocence. Your job is to live your life with integrity and let the truth speak for itself whenever it's ready. But what if the truth never comes out? Sarah asks, what if the people who lied never confess, never get caught, never face consequences? Then you still live your life with integrity, I say firmly. You still build something beautiful out of the ruins, because revenge isn't about what happens to them. It's about what happens to you. The greatest revenge is refusing to be destroyed, refusing to become bitter and broken, refusing to let their lies define your story. Sarah writes this down, her pen moving quickly across the page. Is that why you never seemed angry? All these years, even when I learned what happened, you never seemed to hate Grandpa Richard or Julia. Oh, I was angry, I assure her. I was furious, devastated, destroyed. I spent years crying myself to sleep, years questioning why this happened to me, years wanting them to suffer the way I'd suffered. But at some point, I realized that carrying that anger was like drinking poison and expecting them to die. It was hurting me, not them. So I let it go, not for their sake, but for mine. How did you do that? Just let it go. By filling my life with things worth holding on to. Your father, my work, my friends, this house, this garden. Eventually, the good things crowded out the bad things. The love became bigger than the hate. And one day I realized I'd gone a whole week without thinking about what they'd done to me. Then a whole month. Then a whole year. Sarah looks at me with those young, earnest eyes, trying to understand how someone survives complete betrayal and comes out the other side not just intact, but thriving. Do you think you're stronger because of what happened to you? I consider this carefully. I don't think suffering makes you strong. I think choosing to survive despite suffering makes you strong. A lot of people go through terrible things and they break, and that's not their fault. But I had your father to think about, and I was too stubborn to let them win. So I chose to survive, and then I chose to thrive. And yes, those choices made me strong. And you don't regret anything. You don't wish things had turned out differently. Of course I do, I say, surprised she'd even ask. I wish your grandfather had believed me. I wish I hadn't lost those years with your father. I wish I'd never had to clean toilets for wealthy families, or live in that awful apartment, or struggle to put food on the table. But I also know that if things had been different, I might have stayed in that marriage, might have never discovered my own strength, might have always been dependent on someone else for my happiness and security. This version of my life, the one I built from nothing, is completely mine. No one gave it to me. No one can take it away. And there's a kind of freedom in that. Sarah closes her notebook and leans her head on my shoulder. This gesture she's been making since she was small. I'm glad you're my grandma, she says simply. I'm glad you're my granddaughter, I reply, kissing the top of her head. We sit together in comfortable silence, 3 generations of women in this kitchen I've made into a home. Through the window, I can see my garden, the tomatoes ripening on the vine, the roses blooming pink and yellow and red. Beyond that, I can see the life I've built, sturdy and real and mine. The lie destroyed my first life, but I built a second one, better and stronger and truer. And in the end, that second life was worth more than the first one ever could have been, because I built it myself. With my own hands, with my own courage, with my own refusal to be defeated. They say a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth even puts on its shoes, but they don't tell you what happens after that. They don't tell you that when the truth finally catches up, when it finally speaks after years of patient waiting, it doesn't need to shout. It just is, quiet and undeniable and eternal. The truth was that I never cheated. The truth was that I was a good wife, a good mother, a good person. The truth was that I survived betrayal and poverty and shame and came out the other side, not broken, but whole. The truth was that the best revenge wasn't making them suffer. It was building a life so full of love and joy and peace that their betrayal became just a footnote in my story, not the headline. I forgave Richard long ago, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I let go of Julia's betrayal not because what she did was acceptable, but because carrying hatred was too heavy a burden. I rebuilt my life not to prove anything to anyone, but because I refused to let their lies become my ending. And now, sitting in my kitchen with my granddaughter beside me and 40 years of survival behind me, I can finally say with absolute certainty, I won. Not because they suffered, not because the truth came out, not because I got revenge or vindication or apologies. I won because I'm happy. I won because I'm loved. I won because I built something beautiful out of the ashes they left me with. That's the lesson I want Sarah to learn, that I want all my grandchildren to carry with them into their own lives. When the world knocks you down, when people lie about you, when everything you've built crumbles to dust, you have a choice. You can stay in the ruins, or you can start building again. And if you choose to build, if you choose to survive, if you choose to fill your life with love and purpose and meaning despite everything, then you've already won the only battle that really matters. The battle to remain yourself. The battle to keep your heart open. The battle to believe that life is still worth living, even after it's tried its best to destroy you. I won that battle, and that's the only revenge I ever needed.